Hi everyone. We still have a few attendees coming in, so I'll give them another couple of minutes before we start. Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Michael Dixon, and I'm the Managing Director here at Celerity. Celerity is a leading provider of SAS installation, administration, and hosting services. Today's webinar is SAS Configuration Management with Ansible, presented by Cameron Lawson. This is the first in a series of webinars that we will be doing in relation to using Ansible with SAS. And today, Cameron will give you a quick overview of using Ansible against a SAS 9.4 environment. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A section of the webinar. If I can, I'll bring them up during the presentation, and we'll also have time after the webinar for questions at the end. Now, without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to Cameron.
Hi everyone, how are you all? Thanks for coming today. Can I just quickly check? Can everyone hear the microphone okay? If you have any problems, just pop a line in chat, or otherwise just try and refresh the page. So firstly, today as Michael said, we're talking a bit about configuration management with Ansible. For those who attended or had a look at the online proceedings of Global Forum for this year, myself and Michael spoke on the topic there. I'd recommend that if you haven't already done so, go and have a look at those. We've included a PDF of the presentation in the handouts for this webinar. And there's also a link in this presentation for a live stream, a recorded live stream, and that basically, yeah, you can have a look at that. Now, that's probably good background information for this webinar. In that talk, I essentially went over the fundamentals of what an Ansible project looks like, and the key objects and artifacts that an Ansible project actually contains. So things like inventories and playbooks and so forth. Today, I wanted to actually do just a little bit more of dip our toe a little bit further into some more SAS specific configuration management tasks. And what we'll do is I'm going to go over and basically give you a bit of an overview of some of the related tasks that or plays that Ansible has that really basically gives you a lot of bang for buck in terms of setting up a configuration management strategy with Ansible and SAS. And then what we'll do is we'll actually go through and I'll actually take you, give you a bit of a walkthrough of configuring the SAS v9 config using Ansible. And SAS 9 in particular. There's a number of different tasks that you'll typically undertake as part of your administration efforts. So things like configuring your file system, configuring SAS accounts and groups, operating system config, the SAS v9 config, app server auto exec, and so forth. SAS environments.xml for things like eminer and so forth. And then going through and actually running various SAS tools, so like backup, starting and stopping SAS services, making sure that you're keeping the file system clean, like the work directories clean, metadata promotion, all those types of different tasks. In the handout, what I've actually provided is just a bit of an overview of some of the Ansible modules or tasks. I'll use that term interchangeably. These are the types of modules that you should actually be looking at when you're thinking about setting up your configuration management strategy with Ansible on SAS. So, as you can see, when you actually look at the types of tasks that are involved, you'll see that one, there are different tasks depending on your operating system, and two, there's a lot of overlap. So in particular, things like executing shell commands or operating system commands, templating, and using like the services modules, you can actually go quite a long way in your SAS v9 configuration by mastering those. There are some gotchas though with setting up Ansible to manage your SAS v9 config. First one of those is that a lot of the tasks that you do in SAS rely on SAS supplied command line tools or operating system commands. The main issue with that in Ansible is the concept of idempotence. So that is where the specific task or play that you've created doesn't actually execute when it doesn't need to, so to speak. So if you have a task that runs and it changes a file, with a lot of Ansible modules, what will happen is that next time you go and run that, if that file hasn't changed, the task doesn't run, it just skips. And that's idempotence. So we're not actually unnecessarily changing aspects of our configuration just for the sake of it. In Ansible, command line execution is not idempotent out of the box. You have to actually control that. And that's using some parameters in your plays, such as changed when or failed when, or as I'll show soon, actually only executing them when other conditions have actually happened. An important thing to do, an important concept with Ansible is configuration management and development operations. As a concept, there's a bit of a catchphrase of automate all the things. I would question that if you're only doing that task once and only once, do you need to automate it? And as I said before, if you operate multiple operating systems, be prepared to write specific tasks for each OS. So these are things like stopping and starting services. There are different modules depending on the operating system. Setting up scheduled tasks or cron jobs is another example. And an important aspect as well is that not all SAS configuration tasks run on every server in your environment. And this becomes important where when you actually set up your inventory, that you actually clearly define the tiers and the functions of your SAS servers. So, for example, if you're setting up a process to run the SAS deployment wizard using response files, you won't always actually need to run that on every single SAS server. If you've had a look at the previous presentation or read up or used Ansible, the way that Ansible works is that you have a control server that will then execute and control and manage multiple servers. And it goes and connects to those servers and executes. And the default behavior for that is typically it looks for a parameter in your playbook called the hosts. And by default, that might be all. A lot of people will just type all into that. And what that will mean then is if you've got the SAS deployment wizard, for example, on every single server, which you will in a SAS 9 install, the task that you're telling to run will run on every single server, and that can cause problems. You can start having a pretty bad day if that's executing stuff that shouldn't really happen. In Ansible, as I said, and when you think about SAS 9, there's two real key modules where you get a lot of mileage out of. That is the template task. And the template task lets you configure files in a parameterized manner. So these are things like your SAS v9 config, your app server auto exec config. If you're customizing your SAS batch server, OMA config, pretty much any config file that you're managing in your SAS 9 environment, the template task is a really good candidate to use. As I'll show later, you define parameters or conditions and loops and so forth, and it will render that file for you and then transport it to your target server. The next command, which is slightly more difficult, is either the shell or the command task. There's actually three different modules in Ansible to let you execute commands. So there's the shell module, there's the command module, and there's also raw. The typical best practice is to try and use command. It's typically a lot safer, and it has just some nicer methods to help you change directories and things like that. Shell will actually execute regardless, and raw is a pure SSH command. So what we're going to do is, I thought I'd actually go over the steps of setting up a templating task for your SAS v9 user mods config file. And what we'll do is we'll go through the setup of the project. There's Ansible produce some recommended best practices on how to actually set up your project. Interestingly enough, those best practices don't actually align with the setup of Ansible, particularly on Linux systems. When you set up, if you run like yum install Ansible or apt-get install Ansible, it'll typically create a directory in etc. So etc/Ansible, and it will use a certain file names as placeholders for specific objects. So in the vanilla setup, you'll get a file called hosts, which is actually to hold your inventory. However, in the best practice recommendations from Ansible themselves, they actually recommend setting up separate files for different environments. So there's little things like that, and what we've done at Celerity is we've actually taken the Ansible leading practices and we've adapted it slightly for the types of tasks that we do. We're a little bit different than what you may be doing day to day. We provide install, admin, and hosting services for many customers. And so therefore setting up an Ansible project to run over multiple customers like that, where there's differences quite often with each of those customers, we've adapted the project a little bit differently. You may not need to go down this route, and I guess the key message here is to experiment and work out a structure that works best for you. The key principle that you take with setting up your project is to basically have as much flexibility as possible in your execution. So this is doing things like being able to tell Ansible what inventory you want to run, what specific plays you want to run, methods to actually filter those plays, and that's by, for example, by limiting the host names or the host groups, I should say, that you want to execute against, or alternatively using a concept called tags, which I'll show those as well. Next, we'll actually go through the template itself, and in Ansible, it uses a templating engine called Jinja. That's spelled Jinga. It's a very popular templating library in Python. It's pretty much a de facto standard in the Python world, and it's very powerful. It supports a lot of programming concepts where you variable assignment, looping, conditional statements, thing called filters, which is kind of like processing functions within the templates. And it also supports concepts such as inheritance. So you can actually set up a templating structure and keep your templates quite dry. So if you've got a common header that you want to put in every template, that can be one template file and that can be included in others, and so forth. Lastly, we'll then go over the execution of that and show you within the playbook that just some of the methods of how you actually execute that. So that includes limiting by tags, and also the setup within the playbook of having other tasks conditionally execute if something has actually changed. So when you think about the SAS v9 user mods config file, there's configuration items that may go in there that requires a restart of the object spawner. And what we can do within Ansible is actually trigger that restart in the event that we've actually changed something. So what I might do is I might just actually move over to a bit of a demo. So the first thing we do is we'll talk about the project structure. So just check. Everyone can see that okay, hopefully. The Ansible structure itself, from a leading practices standpoint, you typically have a set of files which become your inventories. In this project structure, I put those in a folder called environments. And in here I have a development and I have a production inventory. We then have a couple of other folders here called group vars and a misspelling, host vars. What these actually are, these are actually looked for by Ansible to let you assign variables to either groups of hosts in your inventory or specific hosts. This is useful, for example, if you have a common key file, private key, that you want to actually use to connect to your hosts. You want to actually assign that to a variable. You can actually put that in your host vars, and Ansible will pick that up and use it. In the group vars, for example, I have a file here for SAS servers. I can put variables in this file that actually relate to my SAS services. So a common scenario for this would be the location of SAS home, or your SAS config directory. You can actually place those values in this file, and then anytime that you execute plays against your SAS servers hosts, those variables are then available to the playbook. The next common scenario that you do is you actually create a plays folder, and this is where you actually store task-specific plays. This is good because what you can do is you actually keep your playbooks quite small. They're a lot more easier to manage and debug later on. And two, you can actually then include them in a wider site.yaml file down here. And the site.yaml file typically doesn't have any specific plays as such in them. It's just a series of includes. So you have you use the command include playbook, and what you do when you invoke Ansible is to actually limit the specific plays that you want to do by using things like tags. We also quite often have a roles folder, and roles we don't have any in this particular project. But what they do is they actually let you either download from a area called Ansible Galaxy, a series of publicly available roles, or you can create your own using the Ansible Galaxy command. And what these are is they're essentially like a modular way of defining a set of plays. So some of the common roles that I've created with both internally at Celerity and also with various clients are things like a role to execute SAS. And what you can do then is you can actually call that role as a play as such. There's a special module called include role, or the role task as well. And what that lets you do is you can actually treat that role, which has a set of predefined tasks and steps that you want to do. And there's also areas there to store default values for variables and so forth. And it will actually let you execute them, and you can loop over them, do all manner of things. In a future webinar, we'll probably look at that, where the part 2 of this series will be about optimizing playbooks. And that's doing things like wrapping up often repeating tasks or modular types of tasks into roles. In particular, other good examples there is things like if you're templating up a response file for the deployment wizard, creating a role just for executing the deployment wizard becomes infinitely reusable for many different scenarios. We also include a templates folder, of course, which we'll go through in more detail. And quite often, if you've got static files, you'll have a files directory as well. And that's the distinction there between templates and files, is that the files will actually be transported to your various target hosts as part of your configuration management process. Templates are actually rendered by Ansible and the Python engine underneath, and then the rendered template is then transported. So if I'll just go through and I'll just show you, this is, I'm just using a single server here, but the concept you'll see is still applicable. At the top, we have a definition for our hosts, and each host, typically you will actually list out here. The first item is an alias for that host. And then there are various commands to actually let you connect, that define the connection. So in this scenario, I'm just running on localhost. I'm just using localhost, and I'm using the local Ansible connection. In a remote scenario, I can actually specify the method of connection, so SSH, etc., or SCP. Private key files that I want to actually use, usernames, passwords, those sorts of things. Then what we do with those lists of hosts is the best practice is to actually start grouping them. So each of those aliases can be included in multiple groups. And you'll see here what I've done is I've created groupings for metadata servers, mid-tier servers, group compute servers, CAS servers, SAS servers. And what you do is with each of those hosts is you actually define what the role of those are. There's no limit on these, and it really comes down to how you want to manage your environment. Other common scenarios, apart from just defining the tier for SAS, are things like operating system, processor types, variations of Linux, those kinds of things. So basically, you define a taxonomy with these groupings, and then you group your servers accordingly. So here we have the SAS servers, and that actually relates to the group files where I had before SAS servers here. Okay, so in terms of the structure of this, what we'll do is I'll bring up the playbook. So here I have a play called sas-config.yaml. Ansible uses YAML as its preferred method of structuring plays. They can also use JSON or Python dictionary style, and I believe ini files as well can also be set up as well as a way to execute plays. At the top of every Ansible file, you normally start, well, as of Ansible 2.2, it was mandatory to actually have a name parameter for your playbook. And then below that, you then generally define the hosts that this is actually applicable to. So this is applicable to my SAS servers, group. If you think back to the inventory that I just showed you, and then we can pass special commands in to define, to tell Ansible how we actually want to interact. So some tasks you may require sudo, for example. You can actually define that here, for example. Here we become, the become method basically means become the default identity that you define in Ansible config. The method, and you can also specify become user, for example. So in this scenario, if I wanted to actually be SAS, I'm using SAS underneath in my Ansible config, so I don't actually need that. Following that, we then define variables. Now, these can actually be defined within the playbook itself, or we can actually use another command called vars files. We pass in an array of different files here. So we can pass in, for example, root vars or wherever in our project structure we have those. And Ansible will actually pick those up and make those available to your plays. In this scenario, I'm just using variables in line. And the variables themselves, they can take on lots of different structures, ranging from simple key value pairs. You'll notice as well that in YAML, the files themselves are all indented. That's quite important. That's typically 2 spaces. And just configure your like previously defined variables as well. So in here, for example, I'm setting up the invocation of my object spawner.shell file. And I've already defined my comp tone and my SAS level I'm actually working in. Variables as well can also take on the form of lists or an array. And in a playbook, that's normally defined with using the dash set up here. You can also define arrays as lists, as I do down here as well. This is a bit more of a Python method way of actually defining a list. But in the YAML file, the YAML parser will actually render that as a list. And lastly, we can actually do multi-level structures as well. You can actually pass in as well Python dictionaries and JSON as well here. And this is really useful for trying to, when you want to set up plays and keep the configuration values that you're passing in as dry as possible. You'll find typically that this is actually one of the hardest things to do in Ansible, is to actually work out the appropriate data structure for your configuration. Being able to make sure that if you've got a value such as SAS app, that it's defined once. Because if SAS app changes to SAS app 2, it's a real pain to go through 20 different files and find that value, change it, test it all again. So what I do here to try and help that, I've defined a set of configuration items here called common config. So this is something in my SAS v9 config file that I'm setting in every single file that I'm going to touch. So instead of actually defining that multiple times, I can actually just pass that in as another item here. Then secondly, I have other items, which just lets me actually specify configuration specific to each app server here. So on my SAS app, I want to pass in no X command, and I have a requirement as well to pass in a lockdown setting. On SAS Meta, for some reason, I want to actually put in no splash and no news. Why not? After you've actually defined your variables, you then actually start defining tasks. And the tasks themselves, what I'm doing here is when you think about setting up mem size and sort size, typically you'll use some rules of thumb for setting those values. An eighth for mem size, an eighth of the total memory available, sort size quarter. So what we can do here is we can actually use an Ansible task called setFact. Ansible runs on a concept of collecting facts about your hosts that you're executing on. And it creates a big dictionary of values every 10 minutes well, basically after 10 minutes, it will refresh the values by default. And what it does is it goes and collects a whole heap of different information about your hosts. So one of the facts that it actually collects is this one here called Ansible mem total megabytes. So this gives me the total megabytes of memory available to my host. I can also add to that dictionary, and I can use that with the set fact command. So here what I can do is I can actually set up two new facts, one called SAS mem size, one called SAS sort size, using my calculation. Then once we've actually done that, what we can do now is we can actually set up our template task. There's a number of different arguments available for the task itself, and you'll see the structure here it plays. It follows the same setup pretty much the whole way through. You start off with the name of the task. Directly under is the task itself, and then indented below that are the arguments for that task. And then once we've done that, we then have a range of different tools available to us to basically loop or pass values to other tasks, or filter as well. So what we're doing here is the template task itself accepts these arguments, the source. So this is the source on your Ansible host, where you're storing your template. The destination, or dest, and this is where we want to actually send the rendered template to our target host. So on each SAS server, I want to pass that through to my SAS config level app server sasv9_usermods.config file. Also allows you to pass in the owner and group, and also the mode as well. So that's normally a good policy, particularly if you don't have UMasts and things like that set up. So here I'm just, for the sake of demonstration, setting the owner and the group to SAS username and my SAS group name. So this is just here by itself. If I actually take this part out, this will let me execute against one single app server. But I've got SAS app and I've got SAS meta. You may have more as well. I'm working with a client at the moment that has, we're defining 16 different app servers. I don't want to go and create 16 different tasks to manage the configuration file there. So what we can do is we can use the with items argument. And what this is doing, this will actually let me loop over this. So you'll notice here I've got an array and I've got different values within there. And what Ansible will do, it will actually, code-wise, it's going for item in this object. So it actually creates by default, makes available this concept, this object here, item, which is basically a single value of this array. And I can actually pass those values in here. So I've got my constant here for conf home and my SAS lev, but the name changes, and that actually relates to this value here. So instead of saying app server underscore conf or app underscore server underscore config dot name, Ansible, because I'm looping through it, makes that particular object called item. And I'll come back to these steps in a second. Lastly, as well, it's typically good practice to tag each of your tasks. When you run Ansible, which we'll do shortly, I can actually pass in command line arguments to say only run tasks that are labeled hourly. So this is good for ongoing configuration management. You might have tasks that you'll need to run once when you first set up SAS, or you do an upgrade to SAS. But then there's other tasks that may be the actual same task that you want to actually run every hour or every 10 minutes to make sure that things don't change, or if they do change, they get changed back to what they should be. So using this type of approach, it lets you then actually have this one task usable in multiple different scenarios, or not usable, the inverse. As I mentioned before, with the SAS v9, if I'm making a change to the config file, typically it's a good idea to restart the object spawner to let those values get picked up. So what we can actually do is, with Ansible, we can actually tell the playbook to execute a task if this task actually executes. So for every task that runs, Ansible will return 3 values. One's called changed, failed, or okay. Changed means it's actually done some change on your target system. Okay means that I've gone and had a look at it, but using the concept of idempotence, I haven't had to actually make a change, so everything's okay. Or failed, which means I've tried to execute it, but something's gone wrong. I can't do what you ask. Available as a variable. So what we do is we actually register a new variable here called config listen. And then we use another concept that's available in playbooks called handlers. So handlers will execute based on commands from tasks. Here I'm saying notify the handler, restart SAS object spawner. If we come down here, I'm using the command module. And the command module itself, quite simple. I just pass in the actual command that I want to run. And you'll notice here throughout my plays, I'm using variables here. In the templating language, the double mustache signifies a variable assignment. So I'm saying for my object spawner location, pass in restart. And then I can use a filtering condition here called when. And what this allows me to do is when my config listen value, which I've registered here, has recorded the status of changed. Okay, everyone following so far? So now I'll go over to my terminal, and you'll see the structure there. So the way that we actually invoke Ansible is using the Ansible playbook command. And then we pass in -i, or oops, if I could type. Typically just -i. The name of our inventory file, followed by the playbook that we want to run. So I want to go plays SAS config.yaml. Just bear with me. Just before I do actually execute that. Okay, so here I've just set up. This is just a little Vagrant server that I've got running on my laptop, but I've set up a SAS config structure for the demonstration. So what we've got here is we've got the objects, like an object spawner folder with an object spawner.shell. This is just a little test file. It's just a mock. Basically what this will do is when it actually executes, I've just got it to actually create a file in that directory just to show that it's actually been executing. And then we have our app context. So these are all bare and empty right now. So what I want to do is actually create those SAS-v9_usermod files in here. When we run it, the output that we get is we'll see that it shows all the different steps that's actually running here. So saying us that we're playing this playbook from that name. You'll see here how it's gathering facts. We've calculated the mem size, we've calculated the sort size, so they're all okay. And then you'll see here that for the SAS-v9, configure SAS-v9 config, that I'm being told that they've changed. So that means that it's actually run and it runs successfully that templating task. And then you'll notice underneath here the running handler. So restart SAS object spawner. That's also run because that's actually changed here. So you'll see that now. Here, my object spawner shell has started, and I've now got SAS-v9_usermods.config file in here. So if I just go back to my templates, this is actually how the template itself is structured. So this is the one that I'm actually passing in. Now you'll notice here that I'm using an extends block. This is actually letting me. This is extending this file here. So it's typically good practice when you use templates is to use a special configuration, a special variable that's available called Ansible_managed. This basically puts a default message to just let your users know that this file is actually managed by Ansible. Don't go and change it manually. In the templating language itself, I can define blocks. So here I've got my header block, and then I've got a content block and a footer block. This template here can actually then be reusable across many different files, like any file that accepts this type of commentary. I can actually use, so this might be for SAS programs, for example, Java programs, you name it. And what I want to do is actually in my other templates is populate the content block, which is what I do here. So in this one, which inherits from base.j2, I just pass in the block content, and then I'm passing in my conditions to actually render my template. So as you can see, the templating language itself, it supports conditional statements such as if, then else. It also supports loops. So what we're doing here is for those facts that I created, SAS_mem size, SAS_sort size, because we're doing some division when we create those, I actually want them to be whole numbers. So I can use the concept of a filter here, which is basically like, this is the templating language's way of executing a function against this value. So this would be, if I was writing Python, it would be int mem size like that. I just pass in a pipe and filter that I want. We can also write our own here, and there's lots of out-of-the-box ones available as well. So all I'm saying is that if my calculated mem size is less than 1, make it 1. I do that for each of those, and that's mainly because I'm just using a very small little VM here. The next thing that I'm doing is I'm actually looping over items. So this is really good for keeping your code dry as well. In the SAS config.yaml file, I've got these two values here, other items and my common items. So the first section is I've got common config where for every app server, I want to set work and utilog. And then for each of these, I'm going to set those as configuration parameters. So for my common items, dash and the value. And for my other items, dash and the value. And then I just end the block. So in terms of how that now looks, and this is what's been rendered by Ansible for me. So out of the box, the default message for Ansible managed is just simply Ansible managed. I can change that, which I can do, I'll show in a sec. So here I've got my mem size, I've got my sort size, values were less than 1 in this scenario, so I've made them 1. And then work, utilog, a set, they're my common options, and then my specific options for my SAS app context. Go to my SAS meta. You'll see now that those values that were specific for SAS meta context are also set. And you'll notice here that the start and the end blocks have been inherited from that base template as well. Now if I actually, sorry, if I just go back. Those files, they've been set up. They should end up changing. If I go and rerun this now, you'll notice that the colors have changed from before. Everything's green, which means that they've all run, but they haven't actually had to set new values. So the templates themselves, it's actually gone and evaluated that template on the target and compared it to what it's actually rendered on Ansible side. They're the same, so I don't need to make a change. So I'm not going to. And because there's no changes that have been made there, my handlers don't actually execute. So I don't have to go and restart my object spawner. So that's really useful, particularly if you're thinking about a production scenario where you want to actually make sure that you're only restarting your services when you really need to. Okay. So that's pretty much the overview of how of setting up a SAS v9 config Ansible process. As you can see, the Ansible provides a lot of flexibility in executing, and it gives you a lot of capability in being able to define tasks specific to various contexts. So now hand over back to Michael to basically just wrap up. And if you've got any questions, please put them in the Q&A.
Okay, thanks, Cameron. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat or into the specific QA section. I'll just give it a couple of minutes in case anybody's busy typing away, and then we'll get back to it. Okay, so it looks like we don't have any questions, which is good. So as we mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, this is the first in a series of webinars that we're going to do around Ansible, since Ansible is a big part of the new SAS VIA platform. And we have been looking, and as Cameron has mentioned, we use Ansible to help with what we do at the moment as well for automating existing SAS 9.4 environments as well. So stay tuned for our upcoming webinars on the topic, as well as some other SAS topics that we have coming up. I will be doing a webinar on SAS hotfixes as our next one. So yeah, please stay tuned. Keep your eye on our website and our Twitter feeds, and thank you all for coming today.
Thanks a lot, everyone.